In the past, especially throughout the 1950s, 60s, and into the 1970s, American cars were undeniably massive. They were long, wide, heavy, and impossible to ignore. And if you look at pictures from that era, or if you ever see one of those cars in person today, the first thing that stands out is just how big they really were. They didn't just take up space on the road, they dominated it. And that raises a question that a lot of people still wonder about today. Why were American cars so big back then, and what exactly happened to make them so different from the vehicles we see now? Because modern cars, while more advanced in many ways, feel smaller, more compact, more controlled, almost like they belong to a completely different philosophy of design. To understand this, you have to go back to a time when space was not a concern in the same way it is today. The United States was expanding, highways were growing, suburbs were developing, and people were driving longer distances than ever before. And in that environment, bigger cars made sense. They offered comfort, they offered space, and they matched the scale of the country itself: wide open roads, long stretches of highway, and a culture that valued freedom and movement. And when manufacturers designed cars during that time, they weren't thinking about making them smaller or more efficient. They were thinking about making them more comfortable, more impressive, and more aligned with what people wanted, which was a car that felt like an extension of their lifestyle. Cars like the Cadillac Eldorado perfectly represent this idea. Long bodies, wide frames, large interiors. These were cars designed to be experienced, not just driven, and when you sat inside one, you didn't feel cramped or restricted. You felt like you had space, like you were in something substantial, something that separated you from the outside world, and that feeling was intentional. Manufacturers wanted drivers to feel a sense of importance, a sense of luxury, and size played a big role in that, because at the time, bigger often meant better, bigger meant more powerful, more comfortable, more prestigious. The same can be said for cars like the Lincoln Continental, another vehicle that embraced size as part of its identity. Long, elegant, and unmistakably present on the road, it wasn't trying to be subtle, it was designed to stand out, and that was exactly what people wanted, because owning a large car was a statement. It showed success, stability, and a certain level of achievement. And this wasn't limited to luxury cars. Even more common vehicles followed the same philosophy. Cars like the Chevrolet Impala and the Ford LTD were also large, spacious, and built with comfort in mind, because the expectation at the time was that a car should be able to carry families, luggage, and everything else without feeling limited. Another important factor was fuel, or more specifically, the lack of concern about fuel efficiency. In the years before the oil crisis, gasoline was relatively cheap and widely available, and because of that, manufacturers didn't feel pressured to make cars smaller or more efficient. Engines were large, cars were heavy, and consumption was not the primary concern. People were willing to accept that trade-off because what they gained in return was space, comfort, and presence, and as long as fuel remained affordable, there was no strong reason to change that approach. But everything began to shift in the early 1970s. When the oil crisis changed the way people thought about fuel almost overnight, prices went up, availability became uncertain, and suddenly driving a large, heavy car with a big engine didn't feel as practical as it once did. And this was one of the first major turning points, because it forced both consumers and manufacturers to reconsider what they actually needed from a vehicle, and for the first time in a long time, smaller and more efficient cars started to make sense in a way they hadn't before. At the same time, government regulations began to evolve, new standards for fuel economy and emissions were introduced, and manufacturers had to adapt. They could no longer focus only on size and power. They had to consider efficiency, environmental impact, and safety in new ways, and all of these factors combined to push the industry in a different direction, a direction that gradually moved away from the massive cars that once defined American roads. Another major influence came from outside the United States as foreign manufacturers, particularly from Japan and Europe, began to gain popularity. Their cars were smaller, lighter, more efficient, and often more reliable, and as American consumers started to notice these advantages, demand began to shift. People who once preferred large domestic cars started considering alternatives, and this created competition that American manufacturers couldn't ignore. They had to respond. They had to adapt, and part of that adaptation involved making cars smaller. Over time, the design philosophy changed. Cars became more compact, more aerodynamic, more focused on efficiency rather than sheer size, and while they gained many advantages, better fuel economy, improved handling, more advanced technology, they also lost something that defined the earlier era, that sense of scale, that feeling of driving something truly massive, something that commanded attention simply by existing. And if you compare those older cars to modern vehicles, the difference is immediately noticeable. Today's cars are designed with precision. They are optimized for safety, efficiency, and performance, but they often feel more standardized, more similar to one another, while older cars, especially those large American models, had distinct personalities. They were not afraid to be bold, not afraid to take up space, not afraid to stand out. But does bigger really mean better? That's another question worth considering, because while those older cars offered comfort and presence, they also had drawbacks. They were harder to maneuver, less efficient, and in many cases less safe by modern standards. So the shift towards smaller vehicles was not just about limitations, it was also about progress, about improving certain aspects of the driving experience that matter today. Still, there's a reason why those large American cars continue to capture attention, why people stop and look when they see one on the road, why they are remembered in such a strong and emotional way, because they represent something unique, something tied to a specific moment in history, a time when design was driven more by feeling than by restriction, when cars were allowed to be bold, expressive, and larger than life. So what really happened to those big American cars? The answer is not simple. They didn't disappear overnight. They evolved, they adapted, and in many ways they became what we see today. But in that process, something changed, something that goes beyond size, something related to how cars make us feel. And maybe that's why people still ask this question, not just because they're curious about history, but because they're trying to understand what was lost along the way. And maybe the real answer isn't just about fuel or regulations or competition. Maybe it's about priorities, about what people wanted then compared to what they want now. Because in the end, cars reflect the world around them, and as that world changes, so do the machines we build. But every now and then, when you see one of those massive American cars from decades ago, it reminds you of a different time, a different mindset, a different way of thinking about what a car could be, and it makes you wonder, if we had the chance to bring those cars back exactly as they were, would they still fit into today's world, or do they belong to a time that can never truly be recreated?